Hello, my name is Drew Lovren. I'm the Wellness Director at the Randolph County YMCA, and today we're going to talk about sprains and strains. So sprains and strains are something that people don't want to happen. You don't really want to get a sprained ankle or strain a muscle or whatever it happens to be, but it is something that happens periodically. Some people have more injuries than others, but today we're going to talk about how to prevent these injuries before they happen. Then we're also going to talk about what to do if you do get a sprain or a strain, and there's a method called RICE that is a good way to handle an injury. If you're not familiar with what RICE stands for, it stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And we're going to go through all 4 elements of the RICE method and kind of talk about how that will help you recover from an injury if you do happen to get an injury. So first off, we're going to talk about preventive measures to help you not get injured in the first place, because that's the most ideal scenario if you can prevent it before it even happens. So one of the good ways is to warm up before you do an activity, whether you're about to exercise, play a sport, whatever it happens to be. If you're just lifting something to move it from your house to the garage, whatever it happens to be, warm up your muscles a little bit. You can do some walking around. You can kind of do some dynamic stretching, which would be like arm circles, high knees, something like that, to get the blood flowing, get the muscles warmed up. If they're warm, they're a lot less likely to have issues with you getting injured. Eating a healthy diet, make sure you fuel your body with good nutrients. Those good nutrients will make your body strong and less likely to get injured. Proper fitting shoes. If your shoes don't fit right, might not have the appropriate support for your lower body, that can go all the way up and even affect your upper body. So having good shoes if you're going to do some physical activity. Stretching, this is especially important after you're done doing a lot of physical activity. Make sure those muscles are nice and loose. If they're loose, they're definitely a lot less likely to tear or get a sprain or whatever it happens to be, because those muscles are elongated rather than all tight. When they're real tight, it's a lot easier to get injured. Wearing protective equipment. So this only really applies if you're doing something that you need to protect yourself, whether it be like a sport. Football, they have the pads and helmets. Could be you're working construction and you need the proper boots, different things like that. So make sure you have the appropriate protective equipment for what you're doing, if that is a necessary element of the activity that you're doing. Regular exercise, that goes along with healthy diet, just keeping your body strong. If you're exercising, your muscles will be strong, and you'll be less likely to get injured as long as you're following a good exercise regimen and not really overdoing it. I know sometimes you can exercise too much, but that is not typically the problem. It's making sure that you make it a habit and make it something that you do on a regular basis to keep your body strong. And this could apply to exercise as well. Don't push through sharp pains. So if you feel something and it really hurts and it's a sharp pain, you want to stop doing that as soon as you can, because that is a big red flag for possibly injuring yourself. And if you keep doing that, the likelihood of getting injured is very, very high. So make sure you stop if you're feeling sharp pains. So this gets into the first element of the RICE method. So if you do get injured, which we all hope that we don't get injured and we are able to prevent them with some of the methods that we talked about on the last slide. But if you do happen to get injured, the first step is rest. So you want to take a break from activities that are aggravating the injury. So if you're playing a sport, say you're playing tennis, and it really hurts your shoulder, well, you might want to stop playing tennis for a little while, let your muscles recover, kind of see what it feels like after taking 1 week, 2 weeks off. The time of rest will vary somewhat depending on what the injury is and what type of activity you've been doing. But this doesn't mean that you stop doing all activities, because some movement can help sprain the heel. If you just sit around and do nothing, that's probably not really going to help your injury, unless it's something that's really, really serious and you may not be able to do any movement. But if it's an injury that is like not as severe as like a broken bone or something like that, you want to try to move on it somewhat. That'll actually help it recover if you're able to move a little bit on that injury. The I in the RICE method stands for ice. So you want to use ice to help relieve the pain and swelling from the injury in the first 24 hours especially. That will really reduce the pain level and will bring the swelling down if you have a lot of swelling at the injured site. But if the pain is tolerable, do not use ice because it can slow down the healing process. So if you feel like you just have a little bit of an injury, only a little bit of swelling, it might actually be helpful to not ice it. But if you've got a lot of swelling going on, you really need to get that swelling down because it's going to be hard to even move those muscles and the joint if it happens to be on a joint. So the swelling going down is definitely very important if it's a more serious injury. Compression is the next step. That's the C in RICE. So you want to compress the injury with an ACE bandage for the first day or two to reduce the pain or swelling. You want to make sure that your wrap is good and tight, but you don't want to make it overly tight where you're cutting off the circulation, where it's super uncomfortable. This will definitely help with the swelling, the pain, same as the ice. So you want to do this definitely for a few days after the injury. It could go on for longer if your injury is still very swollen or it's still causing you a lot of pain. But this will definitely help in the recovery process. And finally, there's the E in the RICE method that stands for elevation. So you want to elevate the injury above your heart with a pillow or a similar object to reduce the pain. If it's possible, you want to elevate your injury for 2 to 3 hours a day, a few days following the injury. I know for a lot of people doing that would not really be possible because you have to go to work, you have kids, you have other activities that you need to do. So just sitting around with your leg elevated for 2 to 3 hours could be very difficult to do. But if you have the time and are patient enough to do it, that can really help the recovery process. Kind of gets the blood flowing, helps that with that recovery process. So these are the 4 elements of the RICE method: the rest, ice, compression, elevation. So you want to make sure that you try this if you have an injury, whether it be to your ankle, your knee, whatever part of your body that is gotten injured. That will definitely help. But if at all possible, take some of the preventative measures to try to prevent injuries in the first place. Those preventive measures obviously aren't 100% effective, but you would definitely be a lot less likely to get injured if you're doing those preventive measures. So thank you so much for your time. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.